There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on the door dressed in the drab clothes of a Tuesday evening, a casual phone call, a simple request from a friend. You let them in without a second thought, because they look familiar, safe. It's only later, sometimes much later, when you're looking back from a future you could never have predicted, that you see the moment for what it was, a hinge. A quiet, unassuming pivot point on which your entire world swung, silently and irrevocably, into a new and terrifying and beautiful alignment. For me, that moment wore the face of my best friend, Alex, and it smelled like stale coffee and the crisp, electric scent of an impending storm. He was sitting on the edge of my worn leather sofa, the one we'd hauled up 3 flights of stairs 7 years ago when I first moved into this apartment. His hands, usually so expressive and full of restless energy, were clasped between his knees, wrestling with each other. The faint blue light of the television flickered across his face, catching on the tension in his jaw, the deep furrow between his brows. He had called me an hour before, his voice a low, tight wire over the phone. He'd said he needed relationship advice, a phrase so mundane, so utterly normal between us, that I hadn't detected the tremor beneath it. For years, I had been his designated counsel on all things concerning his long-term girlfriend, Sarah. I was the safe harbor, the neutral territory where he could decode her signals and rehearse his apologies. It was a role I played with practiced ease, a performance honed by years of concealing the fact that every conversation about her felt like I was swallowing sand. But Sarah was gone. They had broken up 2 months ago, a messy, final schism that had left Alex adrift. So when he asked for relationship advice now, the request landed in the quiet space between us with the weight of an unexploded bomb. He hadn't been seeing anyone. I knew this because for the past 2 months, he had practically lived here. His life had contracted to the space between his office and my apartment, and I had become the sole curator of his off hours. My world, in turn, had become a universe of 2. So, I had said, settling into the armchair opposite him, trying to keep my voice light. What's the problem? Did you accidentally insult a potential date's cat? Forget to text back for 3 days? The usual Alex charm at work. He didn't smile. He just kept staring at the muted television, where a documentary about deep-sea creatures drifted silently across the screen. A ghostly squid pulsed in the abyss, its tentacles trailing like silk ribbons. It's more complicated than that, he'd murmured, his voice rough. He finally looked at me, and his eyes, usually a bright, clear blue, were dark and turbulent, like the ocean in a squall. The intensity of his gaze made the air in my lungs feel thick and heavy. I felt a familiar, painful lurch in my chest, the frantic thumping of a bird trapped in a small room. It was the feeling I got whenever he looked at me for too long, a feeling I had spent a decade learning to ignore. Okay, I said slowly, my own hands finding each other in my lap. Complicated how? He took a deep breath, a shuddering intake of air that seemed to cost him something. He looked from my eyes, down to my mouth, and then back up again. The journey was fractional, a millimeter of movement, but I felt it like a physical touch, a spark tracing a line across my skin. For a dizzying second, I thought he was going to lean across the space between us. The thought was so powerful, so terrifyingly hopeful, that I had to anchor myself to the worn fabric of my chair to keep from swaying toward him. But he didn't move. He just held my gaze, his own filled with a kind of desperate, pleading confusion that I had never seen in him before, not even in the immediate, raw aftermath of his breakup. The person I'm interested in, he began, and the word interested was a strange, ill-fitting garment on him. They don't know, and I think telling them would ruin everything. We have this thing, this balance. It's important. It's maybe the most important friendship I have. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate prisoner. Every word he spoke was a stone dropping into the deep well of my own secret affection, sending out ripples of panic and a wild, illogical hope. I was the most important friendship he had. He had said that many times. We had a balance. He was describing us. He had to be describing us. But my mind, a well-trained soldier in the war of self-preservation, immediately began constructing barricades. It was someone from work, a mutual friend he'd reconnected with. He was projecting his anxieties about our friendship onto a new, unknown person. It couldn't be me. It was never, ever me. That was the first rule of loving Alex. It was a room with no doors. You could live in it, decorate it, make it your home, but you could never leave, and he could never, ever enter. Okay, I managed, my throat suddenly dry. So you're afraid of losing the friendship? Terrified, he whispered, and the word was raw, stripped of all his usual bravado. He finally broke eye contact, looking down at his tightly knotted hands. I rely on them. For everything. And I think they rely on me, too. But this is different. I don't know how to navigate this. It feels like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only two options are to jump or to walk away forever. I opened my mouth to offer some platitude, some piece of the safe, generic advice I had dispensed 100 times before. Take it slow. See how they feel. Friendship is a strong foundation. But the words wouldn't come. They felt like lies, like thin paper shields against the hurricane I could feel gathering in the room. The space between us was no longer just air. It was a charged, humming field of unspoken things, of years of quiet yearning on my part and a new, bewildering intensity on his. He was asking for a map, and I felt as though I was the uncharted territory he was trying to navigate. He looked up at me again, and the confusion in his eyes had been replaced by a stark, terrifying clarity. It was the look of a man who had finally stopped running from a question and had turned to face it, head on. The blue of his eyes seemed to swallow the dim light of the room. Leo, he said, and my name on his lips was not a word, but a touch. He stood up from the couch. He didn't cross the space to my chair. He just stood there, a tall, uncertain silhouette against the ghostly blue light of the television. He took one step, then another, closing the small gulf between the sofa and my armchair. He wasn't looming over me, but his proximity was overwhelming. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint, familiar scent of his laundry detergent, and something that was just intrinsically him. I tilted my head back to look at him, my neck suddenly feeling fragile. The advice I need, he said, his voice barely a whisper, a low vibration that I felt more than heard. It's not for someone else. My breath caught. The bird in my chest stopped beating its wings and fell silent. I need to know how to handle this. Here, with you. He knelt down in front of my chair, so our faces were level. The movement was so unexpected, so full of a strange, nightly reverence, that it shattered the last of my defenses. His knees were on the worn rug, his hands now resting on the arms of my chair, caging me in. His gaze was unwavering, and in their depths, I saw it all. The fear, the confusion, the terrible, beautiful hope that I had been nursing in secret for a decade. It was all there, reflected back at me. He had been feeling it too. The ground fell away beneath me. Alex, I breathed, and it was a prayer, a warning, a question. He shook his head, a tiny, desperate motion. Don't say anything logical. Don't be the friend right now. I can't think straight when I'm around you anymore, Leo. Everything is tilted. I come here to feel grounded, and all that happens is I feel like I'm free falling. He leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching mine. His breath was warm against my lips. I keep leaving, and I keep coming back. And every time I leave, it gets harder. So the advice I need is this. He paused, and the silence stretched, thin and electric. In that single, suspended second, I saw the last 10 years of my life flash before me. A reel of quiet moments, of stolen glances, of unspoken words, all leading to this precipice. How do I make you stay? He whispered. Or, God, how do I ask you to let me stay? How do I stop pretending I'm here just because I'm lonely? Before I could answer, before my mind could form a single coherent thought to bridge the chasm between my old reality and this new one, he closed the last fraction of an inch between us. His question wasn't about relationship advice at all. It was the relationship itself, asking to be born. To understand the sheer, seismic shock of that moment, you have to understand the foundation on which it was built. Our friendship wasn't a casual thing. It was an architectural structure, meticulously designed and maintained over a decade. I was the quiet observer, the photographer who saw the world in frames and compositions, in light and shadow. Alex was the subject, the kinetic energy, the blur of motion that I was constantly trying to bring into focus. We had met in a sophomore-level computer science class I was taking as an elective, a class I was failing spectacularly. He was the brilliant, easygoing prodigy who sat in the back, finishing the assignments in 20 minutes and spending the rest of the lecture discreetly coding his own side projects. I was the arts student, completely out of my depth, staring at lines of Java as if they were ancient, hostile hieroglyphs. I remember the exact day he first spoke to me. I was sitting in the lab, staring at a screen full of red error messages, feeling a wave of quiet despair wash over me. I'd been at it for 3 hours. The frustration was so acute it felt like a physical ache behind my eyes. I was ready to drop the class, take the hit to my GPA, and retreat back to the safe, subjective world of the darkroom. Then, a shadow fell over my monitor. "You're missing a semicolon on line 47, a voice said. I looked up into the brightest blue eyes I had ever seen. It was Alex. He pointed a long, graceful finger at the screen. "And your loop condition is off. It's going to run infinitely." He pulled up a chair without asking, his presence so effortlessly confident it was almost jarring. He didn't mock me or act superior. He just started explaining, his voice patient, breaking down the cold, unforgiving logic of the code into something that resembled a language I could almost understand. An hour later, my program was running perfectly. I had offered to buy him a coffee or a beer as thanks. He had just grinned, a flash of white teeth in a ridiculously handsome face. "Nah, don't worry about it," he'd said. "But maybe you could tell me how you get those pictures to look like that." He'd gestured to my portfolio case, which was leaning against my desk. He'd noticed my art. He'd seen me. That was the beginning. Our friendship bloomed in that strange, fertile ground of opposition. He was the logic, I was the light. He built worlds out of code. I captured the world in silver halide. He pulled me out of my shell, dragging me to parties where I would stand in a corner, clutching a drink and observing, while he moved through the crowd like a conquering hero, all easy laughter and casual charm. I, in turn, offered him a space of quiet. He would come to my tiny dorm room, which was always cluttered with prints and developing chemicals, and just sit, watching me work. He said the silence in my room was different from other silences. It wasn't empty, it was full. It was the quiet of concentration, of creation. He found it calming. I found his presence electrifying. The moment I knew my feelings for him had crossed a line was as quiet and unassuming as our beginning. It was junior year. He was dating Sarah, a bright, bubbly political science major who was, by all accounts, perfect for him. They were the campus golden couple. I liked Sarah truly. She was kind and funny, and she clearly adored Alex. I had resigned myself to being the supportive best friend, the third wheel on their tandem bicycle. It was a comfortable, if slightly painful, position. One evening, the three of us were studying in the library. Sarah had fallen asleep, her head pillowed on her textbook. Alex was working on some complex algorithm, his brow furrowed in concentration. A lock of his dark hair had fallen across his forehead, and without thinking, he reached up and brushed it back. It was a simple, unconscious gesture. But as I watched him, bathed in the warm, golden light of the library lamp, a wave of such profound and painful affection washed over me that it literally stole my breath. It wasn't just friendship. It wasn't just admiration. It was a deep, resonant ache, a longing so powerful it felt like a physical part of me. It was the feeling of seeing a perfect photograph, a single, sublime moment of light and form and emotion, and knowing you could look at it forever. In that silent, cavernous library, surrounded by the smell of old paper and dust, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with my best friend. And in that same moment, I made a decision. I would build a fortress around that feeling. I would bury it so deep within myself that no one, least of all Alex, would ever find it. Our friendship was too precious. He was the anchor of my small, introverted world. To risk that, to confess a love that he, the effortlessly straight, popular, golden boy, could never return, would be an act of self-destruction. It would not only shatter my own heart, but it would also shatter the beautiful, quiet space we had built together. So I became a master architect of my own interior world. I built walls, locked doors, and learned to live with the quiet echo of my own unspoken feelings. I photographed him constantly, channeling the intensity of my affection into the safe, acceptable medium of my art. My portfolio was filled with him. Alex laughing, Alex concentrating, Alex sleeping on my couch after a late-night study session. They were my secret love letters, written in light and shadow, addressed to a man who would never read them. After college, we both ended up in the same city. He took a high-paying job as a software engineer for a tech startup, and I carved out a life as a freelance photographer, shooting weddings, portraits, and whatever else paid the bills. Our friendship deepened, settling into the comfortable rhythms of adult life. He and Sarah moved in together. I was there to help them move, to assemble their IKEA furniture, to toast their new life. Every step they took together was another brick in the wall around my heart, but I accepted it. This was the price of keeping him in my life. I had become an expert at interpreting the nuances of their relationship through him. I knew when he was happy, when he was frustrated, when he was feeling distant. I was his confidant, the one person he could talk to without judgment. The irony was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. The man I loved came to me for advice on how to love someone else. But I played my part. I listened. I nodded. I offered careful, neutral counsel. I was the perfect friend. The perfect, hollow friend. The foundation of our friendship, then, was this: a deep, genuine, and abiding platonic love on his side, and a deep, genuine, and abiding romantic love on mine, hidden beneath a decade of careful camouflage. The structure was stable, the boundaries clearly marked. He had his world with Sarah, and I had my quiet, solitary life, a life that had a permanent, Alex-shaped space in it that he would occupy for a few hours a week before returning to his real home. I had accepted this. I had made my peace with it. Or so I had thought. I had built my fortress on the assumption that the ground beneath it was solid. I never imagined that the ground itself, that Alex himself, was about to shift, sending fissures through every wall I had so carefully constructed. The breakup with Sarah wasn't just the end of his relationship. It was the geological event that would bring my entire, carefully contained world crashing down. The shift began not with a bang, but with the sound of a fist against my apartment door. It was a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of evening where the wind has a sharp, biting edge to it, and the sky is the color of a deep bruise. I was in my darkroom, a small, windowless closet I'd converted, the faint, acidic smell of fixer clinging to the air. I was trying to coax an image out of a sheet of photographic paper, watching a landscape emerge from the white expanse like a memory surfacing. The knock was frantic, insistent, not Alex's usual casual pattern. It was the sound of someone who wasn't just knocking, but holding on. I opened the door to a ghost. It was Alex, but a version of him I had never seen before. He was soaked to the bone, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead and dripping from the collar of his jacket onto my welcome mat. But it wasn't the rain that was shocking. It was his face. It was pale, stripped of all its usual color and life. His eyes, normally so vibrant, were dull and unfocused, staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder. He looked like a house that had been completely gutted by a fire, the exterior walls still standing, but the inside nothing but ash and empty space. "Sarah left," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were reporting a fact about a stranger. "She packed her things. She's gone." I didn't know what to say. I just stepped back and opened the door wider, a silent invitation. He shuffled inside, dripping water onto my hardwood floors, and stood in the middle of my living room, looking lost. He was still holding his keys, his knuckles white. I went and got him a towel, draping it over his shoulders. He didn't seem to notice. He just stood there, shivering, a statue carved from ice and grief. For the first time in our decade of friendship, I felt utterly useless. My usual role was the interpreter of subtle emotional currents, but this was a tsunami. There was nothing to interpret, only a vast, overwhelming wave of pure devastation. For the first few days, he barely spoke. He slept on my couch, curled into a tight ball, as if trying to make himself smaller. During the day, he would go to work, and I would imagine him sitting at his desk, staring at a screen of brilliant, logical code while his own internal world was in a state of absolute chaos. He would come back in the evenings, and we would eat dinner in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of our forks against the plates. I didn't push him. I just existed alongside him, a quiet, constant presence. I made sure there was coffee in the pot when he woke up. I did his laundry when he ran out of clean clothes. I became a custodian of his basic needs because he seemed to have forgotten how to perform them himself. Slowly, like a patient coming out of a long, deep anesthesia, he began to talk. The words came in fragments, late at night, in the dark of my living room. He would talk about the little things that were hurting him the most. The way the apartment he'd shared with Sarah was now deafeningly quiet. Seeing her favorite brand of tea in the grocery store, the phantom feeling of her hand in his. He wasn't looking for advice anymore. He was just broadcasting his pain into the darkness, and I was the receiver, absorbing it all. My own feelings, my secret, buried love for him, felt like a grotesque indulgence in the face of his raw grief. I shoved them down even further, locking them in a box within a box. My only purpose was to be his friend. My only job was to help him heal. But as the weeks wore on, something began to change. The sharp, acute edges of his grief started to soften, but they were replaced by something else, something more pervasive, a deep, clinging loneliness. He had always been surrounded by people, by energy. Sarah had been the sun in his solar system, and now that she was gone, he was just a cold planet, drifting in the dark. And he had turned to me, not just as a friend, but as a source of warmth, a new sun to orbit. The shift was subtle at first. He started staying at my apartment not just on weeknights, but through the weekends. He'd make a show of it, saying things like, "I just can't stand the thought of that empty place right now. You mind if I crash here again?" I never minded. A part of me, a selfish, hopeful part that I refused to acknowledge, was thrilled. The boundaries of our friendship, once so clear, began to blur. My apartment stopped feeling like just mine. His toothbrush appeared in my bathroom holder. His running shoes were permanently by my door. His work laptop was a fixture on my kitchen table. We fell into a strange, domestic rhythm that was both deeply comforting and profoundly unsettling. We were playing house, but it was a game with no name and no rules. He was there because he was broken, and I was there to hold the pieces. That was the story we told ourselves. It was a good story. It was a safe story, but I could feel the narrative starting to fray at the edges. The real catalyst, the moment the ground truly began to crack, was another quiet night, about a month after the breakup. He had been particularly withdrawn all day, the silence between us heavier than usual. I found him sitting on the couch, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over Sarah's contact photo. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a kind of panicked sorrow. "I almost called her," he whispered. I miss her, Leo. I miss having someone." The words were a direct hit. Having someone. It wasn't just about Sarah. It was about the absence, the void. I sat down next to him, leaving a careful, friendly distance between us. "I know," I said softly. "It's going to take time, Alex." He shook his head, putting the phone down. "It's not just that. It's the quiet. It's the being alone. I hate it." He looked at me, and his gaze was pleading. "I know I've been crashing on your couch for weeks, and it's not fair to you. I should go back to my own place." "You don't have to," I said, maybe a little too quickly. "You can stay as long as you need." He gave me a small, grateful smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks," he said, "but it's not just about having a place to sleep. I don't know. It's pathetic." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "I just don't want to be alone right now." This was new. This wasn't just about the ghost of Sarah. This was about the present reality of his own loneliness. He was no longer just grieving a past. He was terrified of his present. And he was turning to me, not just for a couch to sleep on, but for something more. For presence. For proximity. He was a ship that had lost its anchor, and he was trying to tie himself to my little dock. I didn't realize, at the time, how tangled those ropes were about to become, or that he was about to pull me out into the storm with him. The shift was complete. He wasn't just my grieving best friend anymore. He was something else, something more vulnerable and more demanding. And I was about to be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The ritual began subtly, an unspoken agreement that grew out of the fertile soil of his loneliness and my silent, complicit affection. It started with the couch. For weeks, that was the established boundary. I would go to my bedroom, close the door, and lie in the dark, listening to the soft sounds of him settling into sleep in the next room. The creak of the cushions, the rustle of the blanket, the soft, even rhythm of his breathing. His presence was a low hum beneath the silence of my apartment, a constant, comforting vibration that I quickly grew accustomed to. I would lie awake for hours, my entire consciousness focused on the simple fact of him being there, just a thin wall of drywall away. It was a sweet, agonizing torture. I was closer to him than I had been in years, yet the distance felt immense, uncrossable. The first breach of that boundary came on a frigid November night. I was woken up by a sound from the living room, a sharp, choked cry. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. I waited, listening. Silence. Then, another sound, a ragged sob. I threw off my covers and went to the door, cracking it open. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I could see Alex sitting up on the couch, his head in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. A nightmare. I didn't even think. I went out to him, my bare feet cold on the floor. "Alex," I whispered. He looked up, his face pale and slick with tears. He looked utterly wrecked, his usual confident composure shattered into a million tiny pieces. "Sorry," he croaked, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Bad dream." "It's okay," I said, sitting on the coffee table in front of him. "You're okay." He shook his head, staring at the floor. I dreamed she was here. And then I woke up, and the quiet was so loud he looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, childish plea. "This is going to sound crazy, but can I just be in the same room as you? I don't want to be out here alone." He gestured vaguely at the dark corners of the living room, as if they were filled with unseen terrors. "I could just sleep on the floor. In your room. I know it's weird. Just please." My mind raced. This was a line. A significant, undeniable line. Letting him into my bedroom, my most private space, felt like a monumental step. The logical part of my brain, the part that had kept me safe for a decade, screamed at me to say no, to gently redirect him back to the couch, to maintain the structure. But the part of my heart that had been starved for a decade saw an opening. It was a request born of pain, not affection. It was safe. It was justifiable. It was a way to give him comfort. And selfishly, it was a way to have him closer. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet. "Yeah, okay. You don't have to sleep on the floor. I have an old air mattress." He shook his head. "No, the floor is fine. I don't want to be alone." So I went back to my room, and a minute later, he followed, carrying his pillow and blanket like a refugee. He laid them out on the rug at the foot of my bed. I got back under my own covers, my body rigid. The dynamic of the room had completely changed. His presence was no longer a dull hum from the next room. It was a powerful, magnetic force right there with me. I could hear every breath he took, every small shift of his body on the floor. The door to my bedroom was left slightly ajar, a symbolic gesture I didn't understand until much later. It was as if he needed an escape route, a way to deny the intimacy of the situation. We were in the same room, but the open door maintained the illusion of separateness. For him, it was a safety valve. For me, it was a source of agonizing hope. This became the new ritual. Every night, he would start on the couch, and then, at some point, after I was already in my room, he would quietly come in and settle on the floor. He never asked again. It just became the routine. Sometimes I would pretend to be asleep. Other times, we would murmur a quiet good night to each other across the dark space. The distance between my bed and the floor where he slept felt like a vast, charged canyon. I was acutely aware of him, of the warmth of his body changing the temperature of the air, of the soft sound of his breathing. My sleep became fragmented, a series of shallow dives into dreams that were all, in some way, about him. The ritual escalated about a week later. I woke up one morning to find him gone from the floor. For a panicked moment, I thought he had left, that the spell was broken. Then I heard the shower running. When I got out of bed, I saw the indentation his head had made on the pillow next to mine. He hadn't slept on the floor. At some point in the night, he had crawled into my bed. He had crossed the canyon. I stood there, staring at the empty space beside me, my heart doing a slow, painful somersault in my chest. I could still feel the ghost of his warmth on the sheets. That night, when he came into my room, he hesitated by the door. "Leo," he said into the darkness. "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight. "My back is killing me from your floor," he said, and he tried to make it sound like a joke, but his voice was strained. Would it be okay if I? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. My entire future seemed to hang on my next word. To say no would be to rebuild the wall, to restore the old order. To say yes would be to step into a new, uncharted territory, a place of profound intimacy that was built on a foundation of plausible deniability. He wasn't asking to sleep with me. He was asking to use my bed because his back hurt. It was a perfect excuse, a shield for both of us. It allowed him to get the closeness he craved without having to name it, and it allowed me to accept without having to reveal the terrifying depth of my own desire. Yes, I said, and the word was a tiny, fragile thing in the vast darkness. It's fine. He moved through the dark and slid into the bed beside me. He stayed on the very edge of the queen-sized mattress, keeping a careful, rigid distance between us. But it didn't matter. He was there, in my bed. The sheer, overwhelming reality of it was breathtaking. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, my body completely still, every nerve ending firing. I was so aware of him, of the heat radiating from his body just inches from mine, of the subtle way the mattress dipped with his weight. I could smell the clean, soapy scent of his skin. It was the most exquisite torture I had ever known. This became the final, most intense form of the ritual. Every night, he would come to my bed. We never spoke of it in the daylight. In the morning, we would be two friends making coffee, talking about work, pretending that we hadn't just spent 8 hours lying side by side in the most intimate of spaces. But at night, the pretense would fall away, and we would retreat to that silent, charged world. The space between us and the bed began to shrink. It happened incrementally, a millimeter at a time. One night, his foot would accidentally brush against mine, and neither of us would pull away. Another night, I woke up to find he had rolled over in his sleep, his arm thrown across my chest. I lay there for what felt like hours, not daring to breathe, feeling the weight of his arm, the warmth of his hand against my shirt, my heart beating a frantic, wild rhythm against his palm. He was seeking comfort in his sleep, reaching for me unconsciously, and my body, my traitorous, hopeful body, was responding. I was living in a state of suspended animation, a constant, low-grade fever of hope and anxiety. I was a photographer in a darkroom, watching an image slowly, painstakingly develop. I could see the outlines of something beautiful, something I had wanted my entire life. But I was terrified that if I added the wrong chemical, if I exposed it to the light too soon, the image would be ruined forever. So I waited. I lived in the dim, red light of our nightly ritual, analyzing every subtle shift, every accidental touch, every shared breath in the dark, waiting for the picture to become clear. I didn't know that Alex, my unknowing initiator, was about to grab the developing tray and flood it with light himself. The crossing happened on a Sunday night. A quiet, unremarkable end to a quiet, unremarkable weekend. We had spent the day in our now familiar pattern of domestic intimacy, a silent dance we had perfected over the past 2 months. We'd gone to the farmer's market in the morning, walked through the park in the afternoon, and cooked dinner together in the evening. It was all so normal, so couple-like, that the illusion was nearly perfect. But it was still just an illusion, a beautiful, fragile mirage built on the pretext of his grief and my friendship. We were living a life that neither of us had the courage to name. That night, as we lay in bed, the silence felt different. It wasn't the usual, comfortable quiet, nor was it the charged, electric silence of the first few times we had shared the bed. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. The air itself felt thick with unspoken words. We were lying on our respective sides of the bed, the now familiar few inches of no man's land between us. But I could feel him not sleeping. I could sense the tension in his body, the restless energy that he was trying to suppress. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster with my eyes, my own heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. I felt like we were approaching a precipice. The nightly ritual had become so necessary, so ingrained, that it could no longer be sustained by its original pretext. His back wasn't hurting anymore. He wasn't having nightmares every night. He was staying in my bed because he wanted to be there, and I was letting him stay because I wanted him there. The unspoken truth of it was a living thing in the room with us, and it was getting harder and harder to ignore. Leo. His voice was a low murmur in the darkness, startling me out of my thoughts. Yeah, I answered, my own voice sounding rough to my ears. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear the sound of him shifting, the rustle of the sheets as he turned onto his side to face me. I remained on my back, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I was afraid that if I looked at him, the fragile control I was maintaining would shatter. "I can't sleep," he said. It was such a simple statement, but it was laden with meaning. It was an opening, an invitation to talk. "Me neither," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Another long silence. I could feel his gaze on the side of my face. It was a tangible pressure, a warmth that spread across my skin. I felt a powerful, overwhelming urge to turn and meet his eyes, to finally close the last few inches that separated us. But a decade of self-preservation held me paralyzed. Fear and hope were at war within me, and the result was a complete and total stillness. "Can I ask you a question?" he said, his voice even quieter than before, as if he were afraid of the words themselves. "You can always ask me anything," I replied, the old, familiar answer of the best friend. But the words felt hollow now, a relic from a different era. He took a shaky breath. I could hear the unsteadiness in it, the tremor of fear. "This," he said, and I could feel him gesture vaguely at the space between us, at the bed, at the whole situation. "Us, lying here, every night." He paused, searching for the words. It's not just because my back hurts, is it?" The question was a stone dropped into the dead calm surface of our unspoken agreement, and the ripples spread out, touching every corner of the room. He was naming it. He was pulling back the curtain, forcing us both to look at what was really there. Slowly, I turned my head on the pillow to look at him. In the faint gray light filtering in from the street, I could just make out his face. His eyes were wide, luminous in the dark, and they were fixed on me with an expression of such raw, terrifying vulnerability that it made my own fear seem small and insignificant. "No," I said, my voice cracking on the single syllable. "It's not." A wave of something, relief, terror, understanding, passed over his face. He didn't smile, but the tension in his features seemed to soften. He had stepped off the cliff, and I had just admitted that there wasn't solid ground beneath us. We were both in midair. He moved then, a small, deliberate motion. He propped himself up on one elbow, so he was leaning over me slightly. His face was closer now, just a foot away. His other hand, which had been lying on the mattress between us, moved. He didn't touch me, not yet. He just lifted it, his fingers slightly curled, and held it suspended in the air, inches from my cheek. It was a question, an offering. My heart was a thunderous roar in my ears. This was it. The moment the photograph develops. The moment of truth. My entire being was screaming at me to close the distance, to lean up, to meet him halfway. But I couldn't move. I was trapped, pinned by the weight of 10 years of silence. He seemed to understand my paralysis. His eyes searched mine in the darkness, looking for permission, for a sign. "Leo," he whispered, my name a fragile plea. Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question shattered me. It was so full of respect, of uncertainty, of a genuine fear of misstepping. He wasn't the confident, conquering hero from our college days. He was just Alex, my Alex, scared and confused and asking for permission to enter a room he didn't even know he had the key to. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me all the power. I could say no, and he would retreat. The ritual would end. We would find a new, awkward equilibrium. Or I could say yes, and everything would change forever. I didn't say yes. I couldn't form the word. Instead, I gave him the answer he was looking for in the only way I could. I lifted my own hand, my fingers trembling, and laid it against his cheek. His skin was warm, the faint stubble of his beard rough against my palm. The simple act of touching him, of initiating a touch after a decade of careful avoidance, was like breaking a dam. A flood of emotion, of all the love I had kept hidden for so long, washed through me. A small, shuddering breath escaped his lips. That was all the answer he needed. He leaned down slowly, giving me every possible chance to pull away. His eyes never left mine until the last possible second, and then his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It wasn't a firework. It was something quieter and infinitely more profound. It was a gentle, tentative pressure. It was a question and an answer in one. It was the taste of salt from the tears I didn't even realize were slipping from my eyes. It was the feeling of a key finally, after a lifetime of waiting, turning in a lock. It was recognition. It was a homecoming. In the quiet darkness of my bedroom, with the sounds of the city sleeping outside my window, The line was not just crossed, it was erased. The world I had known for 10 years dissolved, and a new one began to form in its place. The aftermath was a brutal, disorienting silence. I woke the next morning to an empty bed. The space beside me was cold, the sheets rumpled. For a moment, a blissful, hazy moment between sleep and waking, I thought he was just in the shower, that our new reality would begin with the mundane ritual of making coffee together. Then I saw the note on my pillow. It wasn't even a note, just a few words scrawled on a torn piece of paper from my sketchbook. Had to go in early. Talk later. Talk later. The two most promising and most damning words in the English language. I sat up in bed, the note clutched in my hand, and a cold, heavy dread began to seep into my bones, extinguishing the warm glow left over from the night before. He had run. The man who had asked me how to stay had fled at the first light of day. The silence in the apartment was different now. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of solitude or the charged quiet of his presence. It was an empty, echoing silence, the sound of an unanswered question. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety. I replayed the kiss, his question, my touch, over and over again in my mind, searching for a misstep, a misinterpretation. Had I imagined the vulnerability in his eyes? Had I misread the tenderness of his kiss? He had initiated everything. He had asked. I had consented. It had been real. I clung to that certainty like a man overboard clinging to a piece of driftwood. But as the hours ticked by and my phone remained silent, the driftwood started to feel more and more like a phantom limb. He didn't talk later. He didn't text. He didn't call. By evening, the dread had curdled into a familiar, bitter ache of disappointment. I had been a fool, an idiot. I had allowed myself to hope, and this was the price. He had been lonely and confused, grieving his old life, and he had used me for comfort. He had crossed a line in a moment of weakness, and now, in the clear, harsh light of day, he was regretting it. He was probably disgusted with himself and with me. The beautiful, developing photograph from my darkroom metaphor had been ripped from the chemicals and exposed to the sun, turning it into a black, useless sheet. The shame was so intense, it was a physical sensation, a hot flush that spread from my chest to my face. This went on for 3 days. 3 days of absolute, deafening silence. I didn't leave my apartment. I didn't answer calls from mutual friends. I existed in a state of suspended grief, mourning a relationship that had only lived for a few perfect, stolen moments in the dark. On the third night, something inside me broke. The hurt and shame gave way to a slow-burning anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, but also an anger at myself for letting him have this much power over me. I had spent a decade being the quiet, passive observer. I had waited for him to act, and when he finally did, I had let him run away without a word. No more. I grabbed my keys and my jacket and walked out of my apartment, a cold, hard resolve settling in my stomach. I walked the 12 blocks to his apartment, the one he shared with Sarah, the one he had been avoiding for 2 months. The building was dark, but I saw a single light on in his third-floor window. He was there. He was hiding in the ruins of his old life. I didn't buzz. I used the spare key he had given me years ago, the one I had never once used. The feeling of it turning in the lock was a small, satisfying act of transgression. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silent building. The door to his apartment was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The place was a mess. Boxes were stacked against the walls, some half-packed, some half-unpacked. A layer of dust covered every surface. The air was stale, lifeless. He was sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, surrounded by ghosts, a bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him. He looked up as I entered, his eyes wide and panicked, like a cornered animal. He looked as terrible as I felt. His face was pale and unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed. "Leo," he breathed, his voice a rough, broken thing. "Talk later," you said. I stated, my voice dangerously quiet. I didn't shout. I didn't want to shout. I wanted him to hear the cold, sharp edge of my pain. "It's been 3 days, Alex. I think it's later." He flinched, looking away from me, down at the floorboards. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "Sorry for what?" I pressed, taking a step closer. "Sorry for kissing me? Sorry for leaving? Or just sorry you got caught hiding here?" "All of it," he whispered, his voice thick with self-loathing. I'm a coward, Leo. I freaked out. You freaked out. I repeated, the words flat and tasteless. You ask me how to stay. You ask if you can kiss me. You do kiss me. It was not a freak out, Alex. It was the most honest moment we have had in 10 years. And the next morning, you run. You leave a stupid note, and you disappear. You let me sit in my apartment for 3 days thinking God knows what. That I was a mistake? A drunken experiment? Some kind of grief-fueled phase you're going through. My voice finally cracked on the last question, the anger giving way to the raw hurt beneath it. He looked up at me then, and his eyes were swimming with tears. No, he said, his voice pleading. No, Leo, never that. It wasn't a mistake. That's what scares me. It was the only thing that has felt real in months. And it terrified me. He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. I came back here, he said, gesturing at the dusty, empty room. I thought if I came back here, I could, I don't know, reset. Remember who I'm supposed to be. The guy who was with Sarah for 8 years. The guy who has only ever dated women. The guy who was your best friend. He ran a hand through his messy hair, his movements agitated. But none of it works. All I can think about is you. All I can think about is lying next to you. All I can think about is how right it felt to kiss you. And I don't know what to do with that feeling, Leo. It doesn't fit into any box I have for my life. This was his confession. Messy, confused, and soaked in whiskey and fear. It wasn't the clean, romantic declaration I might have dreamed of, but it was real. He wasn't disgusted. He was scared. Scared of what it meant for his identity, for his past, for our future. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. So you hide, I said, my anger softening into a deep, profound sadness for him, for both of us. You hide here, in this museum of your old life, hoping you can pretend it never happened. Yes, he admitted, his shoulders slumping in defeat. And it's pathetic. And it's not fair to you. You've been nothing but everything to me. And I treat you like this. I'm so sorry. I closed the remaining distance between us. I stood in front of him, the man I had loved in silence for a decade, the man who was finally, clumsily, painfully, beginning to love me back. I reached out and took the whiskey bottle from his hand, placing it on a dusty box. Then I took his hands in mine. They were cold. So you're scared? I said softly. Okay, I'm scared too, Alex. I've been scared every single night for the last 2 months. I've been in love with you for 10 years. Do you have any idea what that's like? It's terrifying. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. 10 years, he whispered, as if he couldn't comprehend the span of time. I nodded, a sad smile touching my lips. Yeah, 10 years. So you don't get to be the only one who's scared. But the difference between my fear and your fear is that I'm not running. I'm tired of running. I'm standing right here. I squeezed his hands. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to fit it into a box. You have to stop hiding. From me. From yourself. Can you do that? He stared at me, his jaw working as he struggled to find words. The tears that had been welling in his eyes finally fell, tracing clean paths through the stubble on his cheeks. He nodded, a slow, jerky movement. Okay, he breathed. Okay. He leaned forward, not to kiss me, but to rest his forehead against mine. We stood there for a long time, in the middle of his dusty, ghost-filled apartment, holding hands, our foreheads pressed together, just breathing. The conflict wasn't over, not really. But the battle was. We had finally stopped fighting on opposite sides, and had turned to face the same uncertain future, together. The resolution wasn't a sudden, dramatic sunrise. It was more like a slow, gentle dawn, the light returning to the world incrementally, almost imperceptibly at first. It began right there, in the wreckage of his old life. My response to his messy, fearful confession seemed to act as an anchor for him. My admission of a decade of love wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a foundation he could stand on. It told him that what he was feeling wasn't a fleeting moment of confusion, but a response to something real and enduring. It gave him permission to be scared, but it also took away his permission to run. Let's get out of here, I said, my voice still soft. I tugged his hand gently. This place is a mausoleum. There's no life here. He looked around the room, at the boxes and the dust, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. He nodded. You're right. He didn't let go of my hand as we walked out, closing the door on that chapter of his life. We walked back to my apartment in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty or anxious. It was full, a quiet space for both of us to process the enormous emotional shift that had just occurred. It was the silence of two people who had just survived a shipwreck and were finally standing on solid ground, catching their breath. That night, when we got into bed, everything was different. There was no pretext. There was no careful distance. He turned to me immediately, his movements deliberate, and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against his chest. I rested my head in the hollow of his shoulder, my own arm coming to rest across his waist. His chin came to rest on the top of my head. It wasn't passionate or desperate. It was a gesture of profound, weary relief. It was the physical embodiment of the word stay. "I'm sorry," he murmured into my hair, his voice thick. "For everything. For being a coward." "Shoo," I whispered back, tightening my hold on him. "No more apologies. Just be here now." He held me tighter. "Okay," he said. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, we both fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, anchored to each other in the quiet dark. The days that followed were a process of careful, intentional construction. We were building something new, and we were both aware of the fragility of the materials. We talked. For the first time, we truly talked. He asked me about the past 10 years, and I told him, not in a way that was meant to induce guilt, but as a simple sharing of my history, my internal landscape. I told him about the library, about watching him sleep on my couch in college, about the thousands of photographs I had taken of him that were really just secret love letters. He listened, his expression a mixture of awe and a deep, quiet sadness for all the time we had lost. He, in turn, talked about his own confusion. He explained that his feelings for me had been growing for a long time, but they were disguised as something else. He had labeled it as an intense friendship, a deep reliance. He'd loved Sarah, he said, but their relationship had become more of a comfortable habit over the last few years. My presence, my quiet, unwavering support, had become the thing that actually grounded him. After the breakup, in his loneliness, that disguised feeling had no choice but to show its true face. He had been falling for me without even realizing it, and the kiss was the moment he could no longer deny it to himself. His fear was real, the fear of redefining his entire life, his identity. But the fear of losing me, he admitted, was far greater. Slowly, his life began to migrate, officially this time, from his old apartment to mine. It started with a box of books, then a duffel bag of clothes that was never unpacked because the clothes just went into my dresser. One Saturday, we went to his old apartment together. We didn't talk much. We just packed the rest of his life into boxes, taping them shut. We put them in a storage unit. It was a symbolic act, putting his past away, not throwing it out, but placing it somewhere it no longer had to be lived in. When we came back to our apartment that evening, he walked over to the front door and deliberately, gently, closed it. He turned the deadbolt. The click was loud in the quiet apartment. He looked at me and gave me a small, meaningful smile. The door was no longer left open. We were in this room together, and we had locked it from the inside. Our new normal was a tapestry woven from small, quiet moments. It was the joy of waking up in the morning and seeing his face on the pillow next to me, relaxed in sleep. It was the simple domesticity of making breakfast together, of navigating the small space of my kitchen in a comfortable, easy dance. It was him sitting on the floor of my darkroom, just as he had in college, watching me work, but this time, when I finished, I could turn and kiss him. It was me, finally showing him the thousands of photos I had taken, the secret portfolio of my love for him. He'd looked through them, his fingers tracing his own image on the glossy paper, his eyes full of a wonder that I was only just beginning to get used to. "You always saw me," he'd whispered, "even when I didn't see myself." The physical affection between us was gentle, almost reverent. It was hands held while we watched a movie on the couch. It was a kiss goodbye in the morning before he left for work. It was the profound comfort of falling asleep in his arms every night. There was no more ambiguity, no more pretense. Everything was intentional, honest, and quietly cherished. The grand, passionate romance I might have once fantasized about was replaced by something far better, far more real. It was peace. It was safety. It was the quiet, steady, beautiful work of two people building a home together, not out of bricks and mortar, but out of trust, vulnerability, and a decade of unspoken love finally given a voice. And so, we learned to live in this new world we had built, a world that had been there all along, waiting just beneath the surface of the old one. It turns out the most profound changes in our lives don't always announce themselves with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they arrive as a quiet question in the dark, a whispered confession in a dusty room. They are the moments that show us that the places we thought were fortresses were actually just waiting rooms, and the people we thought were just friends were actually, all along, our way home. We had finally stopped asking for advice on how to navigate the world, and we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.